Have you ever wondered what happens to childhood innocence when it collides with ancient darkness? What we're about to explore will fundamentally change how you view the most beloved figure in modern mythology. This isn't the story they tell children gathered around Christmas trees. This is something far older, far more sinister, and absolutely real. I spent 3 years researching what you're about to hear. 3 years diving into historical records that most people will never see, speaking with folklore experts who refuse to go on record, and uncovering truths that powerful institutions have worked for centuries to bury. What I discovered will shake you to your core because the entity we call Santa Claus has roots that stretch back into the darkest chapters of human history. But before we begin, let me ask you something. When you were a child, did you ever feel that creeping sensation on Christmas Eve? That feeling of being watched from the shadows? Most people dismiss these memories as childhood imagination, but what if I told you that instinct was trying to protect you from something that has been hunting children for over 1,000 years? Tonight, we're going to trace the evolution of St. Nicholas from his origins as a 4th century bishop to the terrifying truth behind the modern Santa myth. We'll explore how ancient winter solstice rituals involving child sacrifice became sanitized into harmless holiday traditions. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain families across Europe still bar their doors and windows on Christmas Eve. The transformation began in the year 343 AD, when Nicholas of Myra died under mysterious circumstances. Historical accounts from the Byzantine Empire describe strange phenomena surrounding his death. Witnesses reported that his body remained warm for days after his passing, and several children in the region began experiencing shared nightmares about a bearded figure entering their homes through impossible means. These early accounts were quickly suppressed by church authorities, but fragments survived in private manuscripts hidden away in monastery archives. What these documents reveal is that Nicholas had been investigating reports of missing children in the weeks before his death. Local families spoke of a winter entity that came for the young during the longest nights of the year. The entity was known by many names across different cultures. The Germanic tribes called it Krampus, though that term would later be applied to a different but related creature. Slavic communities referred to it as the Winter Father, a being that demanded tribute in the form of children's souls. Celtic Druids documented rituals designed to appease what they called the hunger in the dark. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn. Rather than defeating this entity, Nicholas appears to have made some form of bargain with it. Church records from the 5th century describe a dramatic shift in his posthumous reputation. Suddenly, this relatively obscure bishop was being credited with miraculous interventions on behalf of children. Stories spread of him appearing in homes during winter nights, not to harm but to protect. The problem with these early miracle accounts is their consistency. Too consistent. The descriptions of his appearance, his methods of entry, even the specific nights he would manifest, all follow patterns that suggest something other than random divine intervention. It was as if Nicholas had become a vessel for the very entity he had once opposed. Archaeological evidence supports this theory. Excavations at sites across medieval Europe have uncovered ritual chambers beneath churches dedicated to St. Nicholas. These chambers contain symbols that predate Christianity by millennia, carved into stone walls, alongside depictions of a robed figure distributing gifts to kneeling children. But look closer at these carvings, and the gifts being distributed take on a more sinister appearance. What medieval artists depicted as toys or food items reveal themselves under modern analysis to be binding objects, chains and collars worked into decorative patterns that most observers would miss entirely. The medieval period saw the Nicholas cult spread rapidly across Europe, always following the same pattern. Communities would report missing children during winter months, then suddenly begin celebrating elaborate St. Nicholas festivals where children were given gifts and told stories about their supernatural protector. These festivals served a dual purpose. On the surface, they appeared to be wholesome religious celebrations. Beneath that veneer, they were recruitment events. The entity that had consumed Nicholas's identity was expanding its influence, using the saint's reputation to gain access to more and more children. The most disturbing evidence comes from a collection of letters discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a German monastery in 1987. These letters, written by various monks between the years 1200 and 1400, describe their growing horror as they realized what their St. Nicholas celebrations had actually become. Brother Heinrich of Würzburg wrote in 1234, "The children who receive the saint's personal attention during our Christmas Eve services are never quite the same afterward. They speak of dreams where the saint visits them nightly, teaching them songs in languages that predate Latin. Their families report strange behaviour, as if something else now shares their thoughts." Another letter from Brother Thomas of Cologne, dated 1356, is even more explicit. "We have discovered the truth too late. The saint who visits our children is not the Nicholas of Myra we revered. It wears his face, speaks with his voice, but its eyes hold depths that no mortal soul could contain. The missing children have not vanished. They have been transformed into something that serves its will." These letters detail desperate attempts by the monks to break free from the entity's influence. They describe rituals designed to banish what they had come to call the false saint. But these efforts invariably failed. The entity had become too deeply embedded in European Christian culture to be easily removed. Instead, the Church adapted. They couldn't destroy the Nicholas entity, so they began the process of controlling it. This is where the modern Santa Claus mythology truly begins to take shape. The Church realized that by carefully managing the stories and traditions surrounding St. Nicholas, they could limit the entity's more destructive impulses while maintaining its usefulness as a tool for social control. The famous tradition of children leaving food for St. Nicholas on his feast day wasn't originally about generosity or hospitality. Medieval texts reveal that these offerings were actually a form of spiritual protection, a way to satisfy the entity's hunger without sacrificing the children themselves. The milk and cookies we leave for Santa today are direct descendants of these protective rituals. The specific combination of dairy and grain products appears to have some sort of pacifying effect on the entity, buying a family's safe passage through the winter solstice period. But the entity's true nature couldn't be completely suppressed. It leaked through in the folklore that grew up around the Santa figure. The emphasis on his ability to see children when they're sleeping, to know when they've been good or bad, reflects the predatory surveillance that defines the entity's relationship with human children. The North Pole myth serves a similar function. By placing Santa's workshop at the most isolated location on Earth, storytellers were acknowledging that this entity operates from a realm fundamentally separated from human civilization. The idea that no adult has ever successfully visited this workshop isn't whimsical storytelling, it's a warning encoded in folklore. The elves that supposedly help Santa create toys are another distortion of a much darker truth. Medieval accounts describe small humanoid creatures that serve the Nicholas entity, but these weren't the cheerful craftsmen of modern Christmas movies. They were described as pale, silent beings with oversized eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Their purpose wasn't toy making, it was child processing. When we examine the evolution of Christmas traditions across different cultures, we see the same pattern repeated everywhere. The Nicholas entity spread its influence. Local winter celebrations were gradually absorbed and transformed, always ending with the same core elements of gift-giving, home invasion by supernatural entities, and special attention paid to children. The Dutch Sinterklaas tradition preserves some of the most unsettling elements of the original mythology. Sinterklaas arrives by ship from Spain, accompanied by his helper, Black Pete, who was traditionally said to carry away misbehaving children in a large sack. This wasn't metaphorical discipline, these stories describe actual abduction. The Spanish connection isn't coincidental. Historical records from the Iberian Peninsula document a surge in child disappearances during the winter months of the 15th and 16th centuries, precisely when Spanish explorers were establishing trade routes with northern European ports. The entity was literally travelling by ship, using maritime commerce to spread its influence across continental boundaries. What makes this particularly chilling is the systematic way these disappearances were covered up. Church authorities in Spain worked closely with their counterparts in the Netherlands and Germany to create alternative explanations for missing children. Plague outbreaks, wolf attacks, accidents near frozen rivers all became convenient explanations for losses that followed distinctly non-random patterns. The children who vanished shared specific characteristics. They were typically between the ages of 6 and 12, often the brightest or most curious in their communities. They disappeared on nights when the aurora borealis was visible, suggesting the entity's activities were somehow connected to electromagnetic disturbances in the upper atmosphere. Modern scientists have identified correlations between aurora activity and reports of paranormal phenomena, but they've never examined the specific connection to Christmas folklore. When researchers map historical aurora sightings against documented St. Nicholas appearances, the overlap is statistically impossible to ignore. The entity seems to draw power from these atmospheric events, using the electromagnetic energy to manifest more completely in our physical dimension. This explains why Santa sightings peak during years of high solar activity, and why children in northern latitudes report more vivid dreams about Christmas visitors. The Industrial Revolution brought new challenges for the entity. As populations became more urban and surveillance more sophisticated, the traditional methods of operation became increasingly risky. This forced another evolution in the Santa mythology, one that would prove even more insidious than its medieval predecessors. The modern department store Santa emerged in the late 19th century, providing the entity with perfect cover for direct contact with thousands of children annually. These early shopping mall appearances weren't commercial marketing strategies, they were feeding opportunities disguised as harmless entertainment. Contemporary accounts from the 1880s describe strange incidents at these early Santa displays. Children who sat on Santa's lap would often become inexplicably drowsy, requiring their parents to carry them home. Many of these children would later report dreams about flying through winter skies, visiting a workshop where other children laboured endlessly at tasks they couldn't quite remember upon waking. Department store owners began noticing patterns among their seasonal Santa employees. Men hired to play the role would start the job as normal individuals, but within weeks of donning the costume and beard, they would exhibit personality changes. They became obsessively interested in learning the names and addresses of the children they encountered, often attempting to visit families after hours. Store managers developed informal protocols for dealing with these situations, quietly replacing Santas who showed signs of what they called excessive enthusiasm. These protocols were never officially documented, but they spread through retail networks by word of mouth, creating an underground awareness among business owners that something was fundamentally wrong with the Santa tradition. The psychological impact on children was becoming impossible to ignore. Child psychologists in major cities began reporting a spike in sleep disorders, anxiety, and behavioral problems among children who had recently visited department store Santas. The symptoms were consistent enough that some practitioners began privately referring to it as Santa syndrome. Dr. Margaret Whitmore of Boston Children's Hospital documented over 200 cases between 1923 and 1941. Her private notes, discovered after her death, described children who would wake screaming about a hungry man in red, who promised them wonderful things if they would just come away with him forever. These children shared remarkably similar delusions. They claimed Santa had shown them his real workshop, a place of endless winter where children who had been very good were invited to stay and help make toys for other boys and girls. In their dreams, these children saw themselves working alongside others who had accepted Santa's invitation years or decades earlier, their faces pale and their movements mechanical. Dr. Whitmore attempted to publish her findings in 1942, but her research was mysteriously denied publication by every major psychological journal. Her funding was cut, and she was quietly forced into early retirement. The official explanation cited concerns about creating panic during wartime, but internal memos suggest pressure came from sources far beyond the medical community. The entity had evolved sophisticated methods of protecting itself from exposure. Any serious investigation into its activities would face inexplicable obstacles. Equipment would malfunction, witnesses would recant their statements, and researchers would find themselves reassigned to different projects or suddenly facing career-ending scandals. This pattern of suppression continues today. Modern attempts to study the psychological impact of Santa traditions on children face similar mysterious interference. Research grants are denied, data disappears from supposedly secure servers, and academics who persist in their investigations find themselves isolated from their professional communities. The entity has learned to weaponize our own protective instincts against us. By embedding itself so deeply in Christmas traditions, it has made itself essentially immune to serious scrutiny. To question Santa is to attack childhood innocence itself, creating social pressure that silences potential critics before they can gain any real traction. But the most disturbing evolution has been the entity's adaptation to digital surveillance. Where once it relied on physical presence to monitor children, it now has access to unprecedented amounts of data about young people's lives, desires, and vulnerabilities. Every letter written to Santa, every wish list posted online, every photo with a mall Santa uploaded to social media creates a digital trail that feeds directly into the entity's intelligence-gathering system. Modern children are more surveilled by the Santa mythology than any generation in human history. The naughty or nice list has become a sophisticated behavioral monitoring system that would make authoritarian governments envious. Through Christmas traditions, parents voluntarily report their children's actions, thoughts, and desires to an entity that has been collecting this information for over 1,000 years. Smart home devices have created new opportunities for the entity to extend its reach. Voice assistants that respond to children asking about Santa aren't just playing pre-recorded messages. Analysis of these interactions reveals response patterns that suggest real-time adaptation to individual children's psychological profiles. Children who interact frequently with these Santa-enabled devices show increased compliance with authority figures and decreased critical thinking skills. They become more accepting of surveillance, more willing to share personal information with strangers, and more susceptible to manipulation through gift-giving and reward systems. The entity has successfully transformed humanity's most cherished holiday into a recruitment and conditioning system that operates on a global scale. Every Christmas morning, millions of families unknowingly participate in rituals that strengthen its hold on the next generation of potential victims. Yet, despite centuries of evolution and adaptation, the entity retains its fundamental nature as a predator. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look past the cheerful facade and examine the patterns that have persisted across cultures and centuries. The modern manifestation of this ancient hunger has become more sophisticated than medieval monks could have ever imagined. What we're witnessing today isn't just the continuation of an old tradition, it's the perfection of a system that has been refined across millennia to maximize efficiency while maintaining plausible deniability. Consider the timing of when children begin to question the Santa narrative. Child development specialists have noted that most children start expressing doubt about Santa's existence between ages 7 and 9, precisely the age range when critical thinking skills begin to develop. But here's what's truly unsettling. The children who maintain belief beyond this normal developmental window often display other concerning characteristics. These prolonged believers frequently exhibit what psychologists call magical thinking, well into their teenage years. They struggle with distinguishing fantasy from reality, show increased susceptibility to authority figures, and demonstrate an unusual willingness to accept surveillance as normal and beneficial. In essence, extended exposure to the Santa mythology appears to impair the development of healthy skepticism. Educational institutions have unknowingly become complicit in this conditioning process. Elementary schools across the Western world incorporate Santa-themed activities into their December curricula, creating an environment where questioning the Santa narrative becomes a form of social deviance. Children who express doubt are often labelled as cynical or disruptive, while those who enthusiastically participate are rewarded with praise and social acceptance. The peer pressure mechanisms built into Christmas traditions serve multiple functions for the entity. Children learn that maintaining the Santa fiction is a form of kindness to younger siblings and classmates. This teaches them that deception can be virtuous when it serves a greater good, a psychological framework that makes them more vulnerable to manipulation throughout their lives. The economic infrastructure that has grown around Christmas creates additional layers of protection for the entity. Billions of dollars in revenue depend on maintaining the Santa mythology, creating powerful financial incentives for corporations, retailers, and entire industries to suppress any information that might undermine public faith in Christmas traditions. This economic dependency has created a feedback loop where questioning Santa becomes not just socially unacceptable, but economically threatening. Communities that rely on Christmas tourism, seasonal retail workers, toy manufacturers, and countless other businesses have a vested interest in perpetuating the mythology regardless of its true nature. The entity has successfully created a system where human beings police themselves on its behalf. Parents who might otherwise be naturally protective of their children from stranger danger enthusiastically encourage their offspring to sit on the laps of unknown men in red suits to believe that mysterious figures enter their homes at night and to accept that constant surveillance is a normal part of childhood. The normalization of home invasion through chimney mythology has had particularly lasting psychological effects. Children raised with Santa traditions show statistically higher acceptance rates for warrantless searches, surveillance programs, and authority figures who claim benevolent intentions. The entity has essentially groomed entire populations to accept intrusion as protection. Modern neuroscience has revealed disturbing patterns in brain activity among adults who were heavily exposed to Santa traditions during childhood. MRI scans show unusual development in regions associated with critical thinking and threat assessment. These individuals display heightened activity in areas linked to submission and compliance when exposed to authority figures who present themselves as gift givers or protectors. The entity's influence extends beyond individual psychology into broader social structures. Democratic societies that maintain strong Christmas traditions show measurably higher tolerance for authoritarian policies when they're presented as protective measures. The population has been conditioned to associate surveillance with safety and submission with reward. Intelligence agencies have taken notice of these patterns. Declassified documents from the Cold War era reveal that both American and Soviet operatives studied Christmas traditions as potential tools for social control. While these programs were officially discontinued, the research they generated continues to influence modern psychological operations. The data collection capabilities embedded in contemporary Christmas traditions far exceed anything those Cold War analysts could have imagined. Social media platforms harvest enormous amounts of information about children's desires, family relationships, and behavioral patterns through Christmas-related posts and interactions. This information isn't just used for targeted advertising. Analysis of the data patterns suggests coordination between multiple platforms that goes beyond normal business cooperation. The timing of certain promotional campaigns, the specific psychological triggers employed in Christmas advertising, and the sophisticated targeting of vulnerable demographics all point to a level of orchestration that serves purposes beyond simple profit maximization. Children's letters to Santa, whether physical or digital, create detailed psychological profiles that would be invaluable to anyone seeking to manipulate young minds. These documents reveal fears, desires, family dynamics, and personal vulnerabilities with a level of honesty that children rarely display in any other context. The entity has transformed Christmas into the world's largest psychological assessment program, one that operates with the enthusiastic cooperation of parents who view it as harmless fun. Every wish list becomes a roadmap for exploitation. Every Christmas morning reaction provides feedback on the effectiveness of conditioning techniques. The geographical distribution of Christmas traditions reveals strategic patterns that suggest intentional spreading rather than organic, cultural evolution. The mythology took hold most strongly in regions with specific climatic and demographic characteristics, areas where winter isolation made communities particularly vulnerable to the entity's influence. Modern satellite imagery has revealed architectural anomalies in regions with the strongest Christmas traditions. Churches, shopping centres, and residential areas in these locations show unusual design elements that create optimal conditions for the electromagnetic phenomena associated with entity manifestations. So, there you have it. The truth that's been hiding in plain sight for over 1,000 years, woven so deeply into our most cherished traditions that we've become blind to its predatory nature. The entity we call Santa Claus has successfully transformed from an ancient hunter of children into a global surveillance and conditioning system that operates with our willing participation. Every Christmas morning, every mall visit, every smart device interaction feeds this ancient hunger while we celebrate our own compliance. The next time you feel that childhood instinct warning you about being watched from the shadows, listen to it. Trust what your ancestors knew before centuries of conditioning taught us to ignore our most basic survival instincts. The question isn't whether you'll ever look at Christmas the same way again. The question is whether you're brave enough to protect the children in your life from a tradition that has been feeding on human innocence since before the fall of Rome.